Looking at the stars makes you feel less alone. Not by chance, but because your brain and history are wired to find connection in the night sky. This is not a poetic exaggeration, but a measurable phenomenon. When people tilt their heads upward and allow their gaze to settle on constellations, galaxies, or even a single bright point of light, their psychological state changes. The sensation of isolation is reduced, not through distraction, but through deep mechanisms of perception, memory, and meaning-making. Human beings have always lived under the canopy of the night sky. For most of human history, stars were unavoidable. Before artificial light, darkness revealed the Milky Way with a brightness that today's urban dwellers can scarcely imagine. That sight was not neutral. It shaped cognition, guided migration, and influenced social bonds. The stars were not merely a backdrop. They were participants in human evolution, etched into navigation, agriculture, and cultural ritual. To feel less alone when staring upward is, in this sense, a survival echo. A residue of millennia in which orientation, safety, and belonging all depended on those points of light. Modern psychology frames this effect through the study of awe. Research by Dacher Keltner and Jonathan Haidt identified awe as a distinct emotional state characterized by vastness and the need for accommodation. The brain's compulsion to adjust its models of the world when faced with something immense. When a person encounters the stars, their sense of scale shifts. Neural networks tied to self-referential thinking, often measured in the medial prefrontal cortex, reduce their activity. The individual becomes, for a moment, less concerned with their own problems and more attuned to the collective, to humanity, and to connection. This explains why awe-inducing environments, mountaintops, oceans, starry skies, are consistently linked in experiments to pro-social behavior and reduced loneliness. Yet the night sky does more than provoke awe. It introduces a shared object of attention. In psychological terms, joint attention is fundamental to bonding. When two or more individuals focus on the same external object, they synchronize emotionally and cognitively. The stars create the possibility of joint attention on a global scale. When someone in one hemisphere gazes at Orion, they know that countless others, strangers, ancestors, and descendants, have looked at those same stars. This shared gaze produces what psychologists call imagined communities, groups bound together not by direct contact but by common symbols. Stars, by their permanence, are among the most enduring of those symbols. Loneliness is not merely the absence of company, it is the perception of disconnection. Neuroscientists such as John Cacioppo showed that loneliness acts as a neural alarm system, amplifying threats and weakening health. Anything that modulates this perception, even subtly, can alter well-being. Looking at the stars, then, functions as an antidote, reducing the brain's hyperfocus on personal isolation by immersing it in something continuous and vast. Experiments in environmental psychology demonstrate that individuals exposed to expansive visuals, wide horizons, star fields, panoramic landscapes, report diminished loneliness compared to those exposed to confined or cluttered visuals. This effect intertwines with memory. Constellations were humanity's first maps and first stories. To gaze at the stars is to activate cultural memory embedded in mythology, religion, and art. Each flicker above is linked with a story told thousands of years ago. Cognitive anthropology shows that when symbols are anchored in narrative, they strengthen social cohesion. Thus, even in solitude, looking upward activates layers of connection. To culture, to history, to the dead who once looked skyward. If you have ever stepped into a dark field, raised your head, and felt a quiet dissolving of isolation, You have participated in one of humanity's oldest psychological rituals. It is not imagination in the casual sense. It is a neurological and cultural reality, honed by thousands of generations. And as researchers continue to probe how perception of the vast influences social cognition, the stars remain one of the few natural stimuli capable of triggering both ancient survival instincts and modern psychological healing. The connection, however, did not emerge in the present moment alone. It is rooted in an evolutionary environment where night skies governed safety, migration, and orientation. The bond between human psychology and the stars was not chosen. It was imposed by necessity, and the traces of that necessity still govern the mind when darkness falls. Human beings lived beneath uninterrupted starlight for most of their existence. Long before lamps, screens, or electric grids, night meant immersion in darkness punctuated by countless points of brilliance. The sky was not a backdrop, but a companion, and its visibility imposed evolutionary pressures that shaped behavior, cognition, and even social organization. Archaeological and anthropological evidence indicates that the night sky was more than a passive canvas. It was integrated into survival strategies and encoded into neural patterns that still govern human responses today. Navigation stands as one of the earliest evolutionary imperatives connected to the stars. Migratory groups needed reliable reference points to traverse vast landscapes. Studies of indigenous navigation systems, from Polynesian wayfinders to desert nomads, reveal extraordinary precision in celestial orientation. These traditions demonstrate that the human brain, through hippocampal function and spatial mapping networks, adapted to treat stars as fixed anchors in memory. Neuroscientist John O'Keefe's discovery of place cells in the hippocampus underscores how environments are internally represented. When applied to nocturnal navigation, the sky itself became an extension of the cognitive map. For early humans, failing to interpret this map meant disorientation, vulnerability to predators, or the collapse of long-distance kin networks. Safety, too, was negotiated under the night sky. Darkness threatened exposure to unseen dangers, but stars provided orientation and timekeeping, mitigating uncertainty. Ethnographic accounts from hunter-gatherer groups describe communal practices of stargazing not as leisure, but as vigilance. The predictability of constellations signaled seasonal shifts, aligning with food availability and migration cycles. Circadian rhythms, regulated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, entrained to light-dark cycles. In pre-industrial contexts, stars reinforce this regulation by marking transitions across the night. To lie beneath them was not only to marvel, but to calibrate the body's internal clock against a consistent external signal. Beyond orientation and rhythm, the night sky facilitated social cohesion. Anthropologist Polynesia studies among the Juyu Huansi Bushmen illustrate that nocturnal gatherings around fires often involved storytelling framed by reference to the stars. These gatherings extended waking hours and promoted intergenerational knowledge transfer. Genetic survival depended not merely on food and shelter, but on strong social bonds. Stars functioned as scaffolding for those bonds. They provided a shared reference that allowed stories, warnings, and rituals to be repeated with coherence. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, shared symbolic attention around the stars strengthened group identity, reducing the risk of fragmentation in mobile societies. Material traces confirm the centrality of celestial observation. The alignment of megalithic structures such as Stonehenge in Britain or Nabta Playa in Egypt demonstrates that human communities invested immense labor in synchronizing their built environments with stellar cycles. Such alignments were not decorative. They ensured the predictability of agricultural practices, anchoring the survival of entire populations. Cognitive archaeologists argue that the ability to project social meaning onto celestial phenomena reflects advanced theory of mind. The recognition that others share symbolic interpretations. To cultivate a collective calendar by watching the heavens was to transform ephemeral light into the foundation of temporal order. The evolutionary entanglement with the night sky also influenced reproductive and hormonal cycles. Emerging evidence in chronobiology suggests that lunar and stellar visibility impacted reproductive timing in pre-industrial populations. The absence of artificial light heightened sensitivity to night cues, regulating melatonin secretion and indirectly modulating fertility. From this perspective, looking at the stars did not merely ease loneliness, but synchronized bodies within communities, binding physiology to cosmic cycles in ways only partially understood today. Cultural transmission amplified these biological foundations. Groups that could reliably interpret the stars gained survival advantages over those that could not. Evolutionary anthropologists describe this as cultural niche construction. Humans modified their environment not only by altering landscapes, but by embedding knowledge into symbols. Constellations became early mnemonics, compressing vast navigational and seasonal knowledge into visual shorthand. The brain's proclivity for pattern recognition, a function linked to the ventral visual stream, ensured that these symbolic forms endured. Once inscribed, they migrated across generations, carrying with them not only practical knowledge, but collective identity. The ubiquity of these practices across continents points to convergent evolution. Whether in the Arctic, where Inuit hunters relied on Polaris to navigate snowfields, or in the Pacific, where Polynesian voyagers used star compasses to traverse thousands of kilometers of open ocean, human groups independently arrived at the same solution: the stars as relational partners. Such universality suggests that the neurological systems governing spatial orientation and social bonding were consistently reinforced by the sky. To feel connected when looking at stars today is to experience the residue of that reinforcement, carried through deep time. This long entanglement left cognitive imprints still measurable in modern experiments. Studies on awe, perspective-taking, and prosociality are contemporary echoes of older pressures. But beneath the psychological observations lies the evolutionary infrastructure. The necessity of treating the sky as a dependable axis in a world of uncertainty. The stars, fixed yet distant, became the scaffolding for orientation, the metronome for biological rhythms, and the canvas upon which humans projected both fear and hope. Even in present contexts, where artificial light has dimmed their presence, the neurological architecture shaped under those skies persists. The brain continues to respond with pattern recognition, with reduced self-focus, with subtle recalibrations of time perception. And this persistence hints that what the stars once imposed for survival still whispers beneath layers of modern cognition, waiting to be triggered whenever the gaze finds darkness interrupted by light. The human brain is not indifferent to scale. When perception encounters phenomena that dwarf personal reference frames, neural circuitry adapts in ways that reshape self-awareness. Observing a star-filled sky engages this dynamic forcefully. Research into the psychology of awe has demonstrated that vastness compresses the boundaries of the ego, and the night sky is one of the most consistent elicitors of this effect. Studies using functional magnetic resonance imaging reveal that under conditions of awe, activity diminishes in the default mode network, the system heavily involved in self-referential thought. This suppression reduces inward focus, loosening the grip of ruminative processes that often exacerbate loneliness. The paradox is striking. By making the self feel small, the brain paradoxically opens toward greater connection with others. Experimental work by Paul Piff and colleagues illustrates this in controlled settings. Participants asked to look upward at towering eucalyptus trees. A proxy for vastness, were later more likely to engage in prosocial behavior, such as helping strangers pick up dropped items. Translating this to the night sky, one can infer that cosmic scale generates a similar realignment. The reduction of self-importance fosters receptivity to communal bonds, even in the absence of physical company. This neurological recalibration suggests that vastness is not simply aesthetic, but functional, carrying implications for social cohesion. The sensory dimension of this process deepens its impact. Light from distant stars travels for millions of years before entering the retina. This temporal immensity is not consciously processed in detail by most observers, but the brain's sensitivity to depth cues and distance constructs an implicit recognition of enormity. Neuropsychologists describe this as a kind of cognitive stretching, in which ordinary frames of scale are suspended. Such stretching has measurable physiological correlates. Heart rate variability shifts, indicating increased parasympathetic activation, and cortisol levels can decline in moments of profound awe. These biological adjustments mirror the psychological impression of calm expansiveness that follows extended stargazing. Attention is also redirected in ways that counteract isolation. Under star-filled conditions, the perceptual field is dominated by points of light arrayed in patterns. This organization encourages global processing, the integration of visual information into wholes rather than parts. Cognitive experiments have shown that global processing correlates with improved perspective-taking, a skill crucial for empathy and social connection. In contrast, environments dominated by narrow enclosed visuals encourage local processing and heightened self-focus. The open, boundless night sky is the ideal stage for global integration, training the mind to situate itself within larger networks of meaning. Historical accounts underscore the same psychological reality. Ancient Chinese astronomers, Babylonian priests, and Greek philosophers all described feelings of diminished individuality before the heavens. What unites these disparate traditions is the recognition that vastness imposes humility. From a neurocognitive standpoint, humility is not merely a virtue, but a byproduct of diminished self-focus. When humility arises in the context of starlight, it frequently merges with a heightened perception of collective belonging. The solitary figure, gazing upward, is neurologically drawn toward the idea of shared humanity, precisely because the self has been displaced from its central position. The default mode network's suppression during awe states has further consequences. This system, when overactive, correlates with depressive rumination and social withdrawal. Its dampening during encounters with vastness provides temporary relief from isolation's cognitive patterns. The neural quieting is not absolute, but sufficient to create a shift. The brain becomes less preoccupied with its own narratives and more available to external connection. What emerges is not merely distraction, but a reorientation, one that links perception of the infinite with release from burdensome internal cycles. Experiments involving immersive planetarium environments replicate this mechanism in controlled conditions. Participants exposed to artificial star fields report not only awe, but an increased willingness to engage in cooperative tasks afterward. The findings suggest that the phenomenon does not depend on the authenticity of the stars, but on the brain's encounter with simulated immensity. This points to a robust neural architecture. The response is automatic, triggered by scale itself, rather than the specifics of natural versus artificial environments. Yet the authentic night sky, unmediated by technology, carries an additional layer of temporal resonance, reminding the observer of continuity across generations. The impact of vastness on loneliness becomes especially apparent when considering the relationship between scale and meaning. Viktor Frankl argued that meaning arises when individuals locate themselves within a larger context. Observing stars provides a literal enactment of this principle, situating the individual within a cosmic order. Neuroscientific investigations of meaning-making highlight the involvement of prefrontal regions in assigning significance to stimuli. When these regions are engaged by the perception of the infinite, meaning becomes not an abstract construct, but a lived experience. The reduction of loneliness, then, is not a passive byproduct, but an active cognitive reconfiguration driven by perception of scale. Yet the same mechanisms that soothe can also unsettle. Vastness carries the risk of evoking insignificance and dread, as existential psychology has long emphasized. The balance between awe and anxiety depends on context, cultural framing, and individual differences in tolerance for ambiguity. For some, the night sky dissolves loneliness by expanding belonging. For others, it sharpens isolation by emphasizing the smallness of human life. This dual potential underscores the delicate line between wonder and despair, a line negotiated within neural circuits that interpret scale as both comforting and threatening. In this tension lies an unresolved question: whether the vastness of the stars inevitably pulls the mind toward connection, or whether it can just as easily deepen estrangement. The answer appears contingent, shaped by personal history, cultural myth, and neurobiological thresholds, forces that continue to unfold each time the gaze lifts into darkness. Shared experience has long been one of the most powerful antidotes to isolation, and the night sky is among the few phenomena capable of binding individuals across immense distances. Unlike transient events confined to particular places, stars maintain continuity across continents and centuries. The simple awareness that another person is gazing at the same celestial patterns generates a bond that does not depend on direct interaction. Social psychologists describe this as a form of symbolic co-presence, the perception that others, even unseen, are engaged in a parallel act that links subjective worlds. The concept of shared gaze is deeply rooted in developmental psychology. Infants establish bonds with caregivers through joint attention, the mutual focus on an object that creates alignment of perception. Neuroscientific research indicates that this coordination activates regions of the brain associated with social cognition, such as the superior temporal sulcus and medial prefrontal cortex. The stars extend this primitive mechanism to a collective scale, enabling joint attention not between two individuals but across populations. To recognize Orion's belt in the sky is to join a cognitive act that millions before have also enacted, creating a thread of connection that stretches beyond immediate company. Anthropological accounts confirm how societies leverage this shared perception. In Mesopotamia, constellations were standardized not simply for astronomical measurement, but for the coordination of collective identity. Agricultural calendars synchronized communities by embedding shared rituals in stellar cycles. The same stars that marked the flooding of the Nile for ancient Egyptians also structured communal festivals, ensuring that the population oriented itself around common rhythms. In these contexts, the sky did not merely reflect nature. It organized human collectivity, ensuring that each individual's actions aligned with broader temporal and social frameworks. The universality of this gaze created what Benedict Anderson described in political theory as an imagined community. A villager in one region, staring upward, could perceive continuity with others far beyond their borders. Unlike written language or religious doctrine, which required transmission through intermediaries, the stars demanded no translation. They were simultaneously local and universal, an unmediated commonality that bound individuals across distance. Modern research into collective rituals demonstrates that synchronized acts, whether physical or symbolic, increase oxytocin release and reinforce trust. The act of looking at the stars served as a distributed ritual, heightening cohesion even when individuals were separated by geography. Historical testimonies illustrate the potency of this awareness. During the European Enlightenment, philosophers wrote of the night sky as a reminder of shared rationality, arguing that every mind capable of reason looked upon the same heavens. For enslaved populations in the Americas, oral traditions described the stars as guides to freedom, linking individuals not only to orientation but to the awareness that others followed the same celestial path. These narratives illustrate that the stars were more than passive scenery. They were a medium of solidarity, a visible bridge between disparate lives. Modern experimental psychology provides empirical confirmation of this effect. Studies in which participants are asked to imagine distant others gazing at the same stars reveal measurable increases in reported connectedness and empathy. Even when individuals know the act is purely symbolic, the perception of shared focus modulates their emotional state. This suggests that the mechanism does not require physical verification. The brain treats the possibility of joint gaze as sufficient to trigger feelings of belonging. From a neural perspective, the mirror neuron system may underlie this process, simulating the imagined actions of others and weaving them into one's own experience. Cultural practices further reinforce the collective dimension of the sky. Many indigenous traditions integrated star lore into initiation rites, ensuring that each new generation inherited not only practical knowledge, but also a sense of shared cosmology. In such frameworks, loneliness was less likely to emerge as an isolated psychological state, because the self was continually reminded of its participation in a larger narrative. Modern loneliness, by contrast, often reflects the erosion of these shared frameworks, compounded by light pollution that erases the very stimulus that once reinforced belonging. Yet even where visibility has diminished, echoes of collective stargazing remain embedded in language and art. Poets across cultures employ stars as metaphors for longing and unity. Astronauts, reporting from orbit, consistently describe the overview effect, a profound sense of global connection upon seeing the Earth against the backdrop of stars. Their accounts suggest that the mechanism of collective gaze can be magnified when perspective is radically expanded. These testimonies reinforce the idea that the perception of shared sky continues to influence psychological states at every scale, from villages to planetary consciousness. The persistence of this effect raises unresolved questions about its depth. If stars function as a universal anchor of shared experience, what becomes of societies in which they vanish from view? The psychological infrastructure shaped by millennia of collective stargazing remains intact, but without activation, it risks atrophy. The erosion of this shared gaze may not simply reduce wonder, it may subtly weaken the perception of belonging itself, altering the social fabric in ways only beginning to be measured. The transformation of stars into constellations was not simply an act of observation, but of storytelling. Human beings, compelled by the brain's innate drive to detect patterns, did not leave scattered points of light unconnected. They drew lines, formed figures, and projected narratives. Neuroscience shows that the temporal lobes, especially in the right hemisphere, facilitate the linking of visual fragments into coherent wholes. What began as an act of perceptual completion soon evolved into a cultural technology. Myths encoded in the sky. Constellations became mnemonic devices, allowing vast amounts of information to be stored and transmitted. Anthropologists studying Aboriginal star lore in Australia reveal that these stellar stories preserved ecological and seasonal knowledge essential for survival. Stories of the emu in the sky, outlined not by stars but by dark dust clouds within the Milky Way, instructed communities about the timing of egg harvesting. By embedding crucial knowledge into myth, societies ensured that astronomical observations remained accessible across generations, even to those without formal training. The sky, once mapped by narrative, became an intergenerational archive. This process also addressed a psychological need, the hunger for belonging. Myths populated the heavens with kin, gods, and ancestral figures. For the Greeks, Orion was not a scattering of stars, but a mighty hunter. For the Chinese, the cowherd and the weaver girl represented eternal lovers separated by the Milky Way. Each culture, by inscribing narratives into the stars, transformed distant points of light into familiar companions. In cognitive terms, This reflects the human tendency to anthropomorphize, extending social cognition to non-human entities. By perceiving constellations as family or deities, people alleviated solitude, embedding themselves in a cosmic kinship system. Ritual reinforced this connection. Festivals aligned with celestial events were structured not merely for agricultural timing, but for communal storytelling. The Greek Panathenaic festival, tied to the rising of certain constellations, intertwined myth with civic identity. In Mesoamerica, the movements of Venus were tracked with extraordinary precision, and myths surrounding the planet shaped political legitimacy. Each story transformed solitary stargazing into a collective narrative ritual, ensuring that individuals never looked upward in isolation, but always as participants in a shared cosmology. Psychological research into narrative identity helps explain why these myths had such potency. Humans organize life experiences into stories to provide coherence and purpose. By extending narrative onto the stars, cultures embedded individual identities within cosmic frameworks. Studies in narrative psychology show that when individuals perceive themselves as part of a larger story, their resilience against loneliness increases. The constellations, then, served as scaffolding for identity. Personal lives were threads woven into a fabric that spanned earth and sky alike. Memory itself is strengthened by narrative, and constellations illustrate this principle vividly. The method of loci, a mnemonic technique in which information is attached to spatial locations, finds a parallel in stellar mapping. Ancient Greek orators are believed to have used constellations as anchors for memory, associating speeches with the sequence of stars. The sky thus functioned as a vast mental palace, binding knowledge to visual order. The persistence of myths across millennia is evidence of how effective this cognitive architecture was. Even today, children who learn constellations often recall the stories more readily than the positions of the stars themselves, a phenomenon aligning with research showing that emotionally charged narratives improve recall. Yet myths were not purely benign. They could impose order and hierarchy, reinforcing social structures through cosmic allegory. Kingship in ancient Mesopotamia was legitimized by association with stellar deities, embedding political power in the constellations. To accept these myths was to accept one's place within a cosmic hierarchy. The same stars that offered belonging could also bind individuals to systems of control. This dual role highlights the ambivalence of myth, simultaneously a balm for loneliness and a mechanism of regulation. The persistence of these patterns reveals something about the brain's response to uncertainty. Constellations provided predictability in a world of chaos, anchoring human life to celestial regularities. Psychologists studying uncertainty reduction note that structured stories alleviate anxiety by providing frameworks for interpretation. The night sky, otherwise a bewildering expanse of randomness, became legible through myth. To gaze upward was not to confront an incomprehensible void, but to encounter a familiar narrative landscape. The relief from isolation lay not only in feeling accompanied, but in knowing that others shared the same interpretive map. Yet beneath the comfort of these stories lies a lingering unease. Stars endure while human lives pass quickly, and myths, though binding, could not erase the awareness of transience. This tension between belonging and impermanence infused the constellations with a haunting quality. Each narrative reminded observers that their ancestors had also looked upon these same figures, and their descendants would too. In this continuity, loneliness dissolved, but in the same continuity, mortality was underscored. The double-edged nature of myth remains evident in contemporary encounters with the sky. While few today rely on constellations for navigation or agricultural timing, the psychological imprint persists. Planetarium visitors report heightened emotional responses when myths accompany the visual display of stars, suggesting that narrative remains a potent mediator of cosmic perception. Yet, the erosion of shared mythic frameworks in modern societies leaves the stars stripped of their collective stories, reducing them to data points rather than companions. This loss may explain why modern stargazing, though still awe-inspiring, often carries an undercurrent of estrangement alongside wonder. The unresolved question is whether new myths will emerge to fill the void left by old ones, or whether the stars will remain fragmented into scientific abstractions without shared narratives. The answer will shape not only how societies relate to the sky, but how individuals negotiate the balance between solitude and belonging when confronted with cosmic immensity. The physiological impact of darkness punctuated by starlight shaped not only cognition and culture, but also the body's internal chemistry. Before artificial illumination, humans lived in alignment with natural photoperiods, and exposure to the night sky carried significant consequences for hormonal regulation. The pineal gland, sensitive to light through retinal pathways, governs melatonin production, and in pre-industrial conditions, its activity would have been tightly synchronized with the waxing and waning of visible celestial light. The interplay between starlight, moonlight, and darkness sculpted sleep cycles, mood states, and even reproductive rhythms. Chronobiologists investigating melatonin secretion patterns note that the hormone's peak correlates with deep sleep and immune regulation. Under pristine night skies, the subtle alternation of light from stars and the Milky Way may have acted as a stabilizing cue, reinforcing circadian rhythm. While starlight alone is faint, its cumulative effect across an unpolluted sky provided consistent signals of temporal orientation. Modern experiments with low-intensity light exposures confirm that even weak illumination can modulate hormonal cycles, suggesting that ancient bodies were finely attuned to the sky's gradations. This sensitivity bound physiological health to the celestial environment, intertwining survival with cosmic visibility. The neurochemical pathways influenced by these rhythms extended into emotional regulation. Serotonin, a precursor of melatonin, is deeply involved in mood stability. Seasonal affective disorders, now prevalent in regions with diminished winter light, may have been mitigated in part by the omnipresence of visible stars and planets in earlier epochs. The sky offered not only symbolic companionship, but neurochemical stabilization, reducing vulnerability to isolation-induced dysregulation. Where darkness is now often associated with alienation, it once resonated with subtle cues of continuity, keeping psychological states tethered to reliable patterns. These physiological underpinnings also intersected with altered states of consciousness. Anthropological records of shamanic practices across Siberia, the Americas, and Africa frequently highlight nocturnal rituals under starlight. The absence of artificial intrusion, combined with rhythmic chanting and trance induction, aligned neurobiology with cosmic spectacle. Neuroscientific models of altered states show increased activity in the parietal lobes, areas linked to spatial orientation and self-boundaries. Under conditions of stargazing, these same regions register the immensity of space, leading to reports of ego dissolution. In ritual contexts, this dissolution was interpreted as communion with ancestors or deities, embedding the personal self within collective or cosmic frameworks. The pharmacological dimension amplifies this link. Psychoactive substances such as psilocybin or peyote, used in night rituals, interact with serotonin receptors, enhancing visual and emotional sensitivity. Combined with starlight, these compounds intensified the perception of interconnectedness. Modern neuroimaging of psychedelic states shows reduced activity in the default mode network, mirroring the dampening observed during awe. The convergence suggests that ritual use of substances beneath the stars harnessed and magnified innate neural responses to cosmic scale, transforming loneliness into an experience of profound belonging. Historical accounts from classical antiquity echo these dynamics, though through different cultural lenses. In the Mysteries of Eleusis in Greece, Initiates underwent nocturnal ceremonies believed to involve altered consciousness. Ancient writers, bound by vows of secrecy, described transformative visions under starlit skies, often framed as encounters with divine presence. Though the exact substances and practices remain debated, the consistent emphasis on night and the heavens implies that the stars functioned as catalysts for transcendence. Whether interpreted as divine epiphany or neurochemical event, the effect was the same. Individuals emerged convinced of their embeddedness in a larger order, reducing the felt weight of solitary existence. Contemporary science revisits these intersections with new frameworks. Studies on awe-induced states reveal increased levels of oxytocin, the so-called bonding hormone. Elevated oxytocin enhances trust and social closeness, counteracting loneliness. When subjects report profound connection during stargazing or controlled psychedelic experiences, measurable biochemical shifts corroborate their accounts. The brain and body are not passive recipients of cosmic spectacle, but active participants, reorganizing neurochemistry in response to perception of vastness. Yet these physiological processes contain ambiguities. Just as the stars can soothe, they can also destabilize. Reports of cosmic dread or existential vertigo illustrate how the same neural circuits that reduce self-focus can induce anxiety when confronted with immensity. The thinning of ego boundaries may dissolve loneliness for some, but for others it sharpens vulnerability, evoking a sense of insignificance. Neuroscience identifies individual differences in tolerance for ambiguity and openness to experience as key moderators of these outcomes. Where one mind experiences connection, another perceives disintegration. The variability underscores that the relationship between stars and human physiology is not fixed, but contingent. It depends on cultural framing, personal predisposition, and the intricate balance of neurochemical states. What is consistent is that the sky exerts pressure on the body and mind alike, reshaping their rhythms whether or not the observer consciously recognizes it. Each gaze upward engages biological systems evolved under cosmic cycles, pulling them into alignment or disarray, depending on circumstance. This interplay of physiology and perception raises pressing questions for societies that now live beneath obscured skies. Artificial light, pervasive in urban environments, disrupts melatonin cycles, fractures circadian rhythms, and diminishes opportunities for awe-induced states. The absence of visible stars is not merely aesthetic, but biological, stripping the body of cues that once stabilized mood and reinforced connection. The long-term consequences of this deprivation remain insufficiently measured, but early evidence suggests links to rising rates of insomnia, mood disorders, and social isolation. The body still remembers what the sky once provided, and its deprivation leaves subtle but significant voids. To understand these voids requires examining not only what is lost physiologically, but also how societies attempt to compensate, whether through artificial environments like planetariums or through pharmacological interventions designed to restore balance. These compensations raise further questions about whether the modern mind can replicate the ancient synchrony of body and stars, or whether a deeper estrangement is unfolding, one that reshapes both health and belonging. Navigation was one of the most direct ways in which the night sky entered into human survival. Before magnetic compasses or modern instruments, orientation depended on the predictable movement of celestial bodies. The North Star, fixed in apparent position, became a reference point across hemispheres, and its reliability provided security not only to travelers, but to entire societies dependent on trade and exploration. The ability to locate oneself beneath the stars reduced the vulnerability of being lost, transforming solitude into situational control. Anthropological research among Pacific Island navigators reveals the sophistication of this skill. The Polynesian art of wayfinding employed star paths, memorized sequences of rising and setting points along the horizon, to traverse thousands of kilometers of open ocean. Neurological studies of expert navigators suggest intensive activation of hippocampal circuits, the same brain regions responsible for spatial memory. In effect, the stars became an external map inscribed in the mind, strengthening cognitive networks while simultaneously embedding individuals in traditions transmitted across generations. Knowledge of the heavens here was inseparable from community, for no navigator existed outside a lineage of teachers and apprentices. In the Northern Hemisphere, seafaring cultures developed equally complex systems. The Vikings relied on the sunstone, a crystal thought to polarize light, yet their orientation still depended on reference to stellar positions when weather permitted. Medieval Arab astronomers refined instruments such as the astrolabe, combining mathematical precision with celestial observation. Each innovation reinforced the perception that the stars offered not just beauty, but security, anchoring the individual to a navigable world. To be under a starry sky was to be less alone, because one's direction was knowable and one's path part of an inherited body of knowledge. Navigation under the stars also had profound psychological implications. Research into uncertainty reduction shows that predictable cues decrease anxiety and enhance resilience. The vastness of the sea or desert, otherwise overwhelming, became traversable when paired with stellar reference. The night sky alleviated the dread of exposure, offering orientation where terrestrial markers vanished. This reduction of existential vulnerability reshaped the emotional quality of solitude. A sailor alone on deck at night was never wholly isolated. The sky provided orientation and assurance that others had followed the same paths before. Religious and political power drew upon this navigational dimension. In the Islamic world, determining the Qibla, the direction of Mecca, relied heavily on celestial calculation, ensuring that prayer aligned with the heavens. In imperial China, accurate astronomy validated the authority of the ruling dynasty, with failure to predict celestial events interpreted as a sign of illegitimacy. The stars functioned as arbiters of order, guiding not only physical travel but social hierarchy. To look upward was to recognize one's place within both geography and governance, reinforcing belonging to a system larger than the self. The psychological bond between navigation and companionship appears even in modern accounts. Polar explorers, cut off from familiar environments, often describe the relief of seeing constellations reappear in alien skies. The repetition of familiar star patterns served as a symbolic homecoming, a reminder that even at the edge of human habitation, connection to ancestral knowledge endured. Cognitive scientists suggest that recognition of known constellations activates the same neural pathways engaged by recognition of familiar faces, producing comfort through pattern familiarity. The sky was not anonymous. It bore the signatures of tradition, memory, and orientation. Navigation also carried a temporal dimension. By observing the stars' seasonal movements, societies synchronized with cycles of planting and migration. This temporal orientation extended belonging into the future, allowing individuals to locate themselves within unfolding patterns. Studies in temporal psychology demonstrate that perceiving oneself as part of longer trajectories reduces existential anxiety and strengthens social identity. The stars offered continuity not only across space but across time, embedding solitary individuals within generations past and yet to come. Yet dependence on celestial navigation carried inherent vulnerabilities. Clouded skies or disorientation in the southern oceans, where familiar constellations vanished, exposed the fragility of this reliance. Accounts of shipwrecks and failed expeditions reveal the psychological toll of losing stellar reference. The absence of navigational certainty transformed awe into fear, underscoring how the same sky that guided could also abandon. Neuroscientific research on spatial disorientation confirms that when reliable cues disappear, stress hormones rise sharply, impairing decision-making. The stars offered connection, but their absence left profound isolation. In modern contexts, The functional role of stars in navigation has diminished, yet echoes of their significance persist. Astronauts continue to rely on star trackers for spacecraft orientation, an extension of ancient practices into technological form. Pilots describe comfort in confirming position against known constellations when instruments falter. Even GPS, though abstract, draws lineage from the principle that orientation begins with reference to the heavens. The symbolic weight remains. Humanity still anchors its movement through the universe by looking outward. This enduring role of the stars as guides, both physical and psychological, leaves open questions about how orientation shapes belonging. When direction is secured by artificial systems rather than celestial bodies, does the sense of companionship provided by the sky diminish, or does it transform into new forms of reliance? The unresolved tension between ancient navigation and modern technology highlights how deeply embedded stellar reference remains in the architecture of human meaning. The social role of starlight extended beyond navigation and storytelling into the regulation of collective gatherings. Across early civilizations, communal life often intensified under the night sky, where fires and stars together structured patterns of assembly. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Göbekli Tepe suggests that megalithic architecture was aligned with celestial phenomena, implying that gatherings of considerable scale were orchestrated in dialogue with the heavens. The alignment of monumental structures, with specific constellations or solstices, transformed architecture into a mediator between human community and cosmic order. Anthropologists examining ritual assemblies note the importance of rhythmic synchronization in fostering cohesion. Drumming, chanting, and dancing beneath the stars synchronized heart rates and neural oscillations across participants. Neuroscientific research shows that such collective rhythmic activity increases endorphin release, producing analgesic effects and deepening social bonds. The presence of the night sky amplified these processes by providing an unchanging canopy under which collective identity could be reinforced. Ritual under the stars was not a private act of transcendence, but a physiological mechanism for social solidarity. In pastoral societies, nighttime gatherings often accompanied seasonal migrations. The Maasai in East Africa held ceremonies under starlight that marked age-grade transitions, embedding individuals within the structure of lineage and duty. Here, the stars were not only observers but participants, their presence certifying the legitimacy of social transformations. The absence of daylight conferred an aura of otherworldliness, heightening the sense that community extended beyond the living to include ancestors who had also witnessed the same constellations. Psychological studies on ritual salience suggest that environmental distinctiveness enhances memory consolidation, ensuring that events staged under the night sky remained indelible in communal recollection. The political dimension of starlit assembly emerges prominently in classical societies. The Roman Saturnalia, although celebrated during winter, incorporated celestial timing as a symbolic return to primordial order. By situating civic rituals in dialogue with the heavens, political authority reinforced its legitimacy as aligned with cosmic cycles. In China, the imperial court staged elaborate ceremonies timed to solstices and equinoxes, with astronomical officials ensuring alignment between state order and celestial mechanics. To participate in such events was to experience belonging not only to a polity but to a cosmic hierarchy, reinforcing the perception that isolation was incompatible with the shared gaze of society and stars. The night sky also facilitated transmission of oral traditions. Without written texts, memory relied on collective recitation, often conducted under stars whose permanence symbolized the continuity of knowledge. Ethnographers recording Inuit traditions describe how elders narrated constellations as living beings, embedding moral instruction into the sky itself. The darkness heightened auditory focus, and the visual presence of constellations anchored narratives in concrete imagery. Cognitive psychology supports this arrangement. Multimodal reinforcement, combining visual and auditory cues, strengthens retention. The sky thus served as both stage and script, embedding moral codes and histories into a shared perceptual field. The aesthetics of star-filled nights intensified artistic creation. Cave paintings depicting star clusters, such as those at Lascaux, suggest that even Paleolithic art was influenced by celestial observation. Scholars argue that depictions of the Pleiades within these caves indicate deliberate attempts to inscribe the sky into collective symbolic systems. By painting stars, communities extended their presence into enclosed spaces, ensuring continuity between the open night and the protected shelter. This interplay between exterior sky and interior symbol reinforced a sense of unity, bridging the solitary experience of stargazing with communal expression in art. The psychological impact of communal stargazing has been probed in modern experiments. Studies show that individuals exposed to awe-inspiring stimuli in group settings report stronger increases in prosociality than those exposed alone. Collective awe magnifies social bonding, as participants perceive themselves as small but simultaneously part of something greater. Observing the Milky Way with others, even without verbal exchange, activates neural circuits associated with trust and cooperation. The stars, by dwarfing individual concerns, recalibrate the scale of self in relation to others, fostering behaviors that counteract isolation. Yet communal stargazing also reveals tensions. While rituals under the night sky reinforced unity, they could simultaneously exclude. Membership in ceremonies was often restricted by gender, age, or caste, turning the sky into a boundary as much as a bridge. In certain Polynesian traditions, only trained navigators were permitted access to specific star knowledge, embedding hierarchy into the very act of looking upward. Such exclusivity underscores that the psychological relief from loneliness provided by the stars was not universally accessible but mediated by social structures. Belonging was contingent on participation, and exclusion could deepen isolation even under the same canopy. Modern societies retain vestiges of these communal functions, though in altered form. Public astronomy events, meteor shower gatherings, and solar eclipse viewings draw crowds into collective awe reminiscent of ancient assemblies. Reports from participants describe a temporary suspension of individual preoccupations, replaced by shared focus on celestial spectacle. Yet these events occur within a context of urban light pollution that has stripped the night sky of its ubiquity, making such gatherings rare and exceptional. The scarcity of visible stars renders communal stargazing both more desired and more fragile, highlighting the contrast between ancient continuity and modern disruption. This scarcity forces a reconsideration of how societies anchor social belonging without consistent access to cosmic spectacle. Where once the stars served as universal witnesses of human gatherings, now their visibility depends on deliberate travel to remote regions. The implications for cultural continuity, identity formation, and psychological well-being remain uncertain, raising unresolved questions about whether modern substitutes can replicate the stabilizing role of shared starlight, or whether new forms of collective ritual must emerge to bridge the widening gap. The philosophical implications of the night sky gradually became central to the development of metaphysical thought. Greek philosophers used the stars as evidence for the existence of order beyond human affairs. Plato described the heavens as the model of perfection, unchanging and circular, in contrast to the corruption of earthly life. Aristotle's notion of the unmoved mover relied on the observation of celestial spheres that seemed eternal in their rotations. The stars thus provided a framework for speculations about causality, permanence, and the possibility of a higher order. These speculations were not abstract diversions. They addressed the fundamental question of whether human existence unfolded within chaos or within a structured cosmos. In India, Vedic traditions embedded astronomical observation into philosophical systems of time. The concept of yugas, vast cycles of cosmic ages, reflected not only mythological imagination, but also attention to the recurrence of celestial patterns. The night sky became a canvas for articulating temporal immensity, dwarfing individual lives and situating them within epochs that extended beyond comprehension. Such framing provided existential orientation. Solitude was recontextualized not as abandonment, but as participation in cycles so vast they rendered personal suffering transient. Cognitive science suggests that this recontextualization engages neural networks associated with meaning-making, dampening stress responses by embedding individual concerns within larger narratives. The Islamic Golden Age advanced these inquiries by merging empirical astronomy with metaphysical reflection. Scholars such as al-Biruni and Ibn al-Haytham not only measured stellar positions with precision, but also interrogated their philosophical significance. For them, studying the stars was a pathway to understanding divine order, a form of intellectual devotion. The systematic observation of the heavens reinforced the conviction that human minds were capable of grasping truths beyond immediate perception. This conviction offered protection against existential loneliness, for the very act of inquiry aligned the seeker with an order larger than the self. The tension between mechanistic explanation and spiritual resonance intensified during the scientific revolution. Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler dismantled geocentric cosmologies, reconfiguring humanity's position in the universe. The shift was not merely technical, it destabilized inherited frameworks of belonging. To learn that Earth was not the cosmic center forced a psychological reorientation. Records from the period reveal both exhilaration and dread. Exhilaration at uncovering hidden structures of the cosmos. Dread at confronting human insignificance within a vast, indifferent universe. Modern psychology terms this duality the awe-terror balance, where the same perception of immensity can soothe or unsettle depending on interpretive frameworks. Enlightenment thinkers seized on the stars as proof of rational order. Kant argued that the starry heavens above exemplified the moral law within, suggesting that contemplation of cosmic immensity triggered awareness of ethical duty. This linkage of external order with internal morality exemplifies the way stargazing reshaped not only metaphysical reflection, but ethical self-conception. To feel less alone beneath the stars was not merely to sense companionship, but to recognize oneself as a moral agent within a structured totality. The sky conferred not only orientation, but obligation. Romanticism transformed the tone yet again. Poets, such as Wordsworth and Novalis, framed the stars as sources of emotional intensity, bridging individual feeling with cosmic beauty. Romantic stargazing emphasized the subjective, celebrating personal experience of vastness rather than universal order. Yet even here, loneliness dissolved into connectedness, as personal emotion was amplified by its resonance with the infinite. Neuroscience provides insight into this shift. Aesthetic experience engages dopaminergic pathways linked to reward and motivation, suggesting that the pleasure of perceiving beauty in the night sky reinforced feelings of vitality and belonging. In the 20th century, existentialist philosophers confronted the night sky in darker tones. Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus described the heavens as symbols of absurdity, their indifference exposing the lack of inherent meaning. Yet, even in this interpretation, the stars compelled engagement. For Camus, the confrontation with cosmic indifference necessitated the creation of meaning through human solidarity. The night sky became a mirror of existential condition, vast, silent, unyielding, and yet demanding response. Here again, isolation could not remain absolute, for the act of shared recognition created its own form of connection. Contemporary philosophy continues to wrestle with these themes. Environmental thinkers emphasize the loss of the night sky to light pollution as a deprivation not only of beauty, but of moral and existential orientation. The diminished visibility of stars, they argue, impoverishes the human capacity to situate existence within broader frameworks. Studies in environmental psychology support this concern, linking reduced exposure to natural nightscapes with increased rates of alienation and diminished sense of coherence. The absence of the night sky removes not only a source of awe but a foundation for ethical and philosophical reflection. The question emerges of how modern technological societies will reconstruct metaphysical orientation in the absence of unmediated starlight. Planetariums, astrophotography, and simulations attempt to replicate the experience, yet the authenticity of mediated skies remains contested. For some, digital recreations suffice to trigger awe responses. For others, the lack of direct encounter strips them of their transformative force. The debate underscores the fragility of the bond between human meaning-making and cosmic perception, and whether it can survive in altered forms. The unresolved issue is whether philosophy anchored in the stars can persist when access to the stars themselves becomes intermittent and artificial. The answer carries consequences not only for metaphysical systems, but for the ways in which human beings will continue to negotiate the balance between solitude and belonging in a universe that remains vast, indifferent, and yet profoundly compelling. The psychological resonance of the night sky became most pronounced when it intersected with mortality and the search for continuity beyond death. Across cultures, stars were frequently interpreted as the souls of the departed, their permanence contrasting with the fragility of human life. Among the ancient Egyptians, the belief that pharaohs ascended to the heavens to dwell among the imperishable stars reinforced both political legitimacy and existential reassurance. The architectural alignment of pyramids toward specific stellar configurations illustrates this conviction that cosmic order absorbed individual mortality into a broader continuum. In indigenous traditions of the Americas, stars were often framed as ancestors, maintaining presence in the night. The Lakota, for instance, conceived of the Milky Way as the spirit road, a path along which souls traveled after death. This cosmological map provided comfort in bereavement, for the departed were not imagined as vanished but as relocated to a visible, enduring domain. Cognitive studies of grief indicate that symbolic continuity with the deceased alleviates feelings of isolation, suggesting that these star-based beliefs provided measurable psychological relief. By embedding death within the visible sky, loneliness in mourning was softened by the assurance of ongoing companionship above. Astronomical burial practices further demonstrate this role. Neolithic passage tombs, such as Newgrange in Ireland, are aligned to capture light from specific celestial events, particularly the winter solstice sunrise. Archaeologists interpret these alignments as ritual enactments of rebirth, projecting the deceased into cosmic cycles. The light that entered the tomb symbolically united the dead with stellar rhythms, reinforcing the sense that human existence extended beyond individual boundaries. The physical architecture became a bridge between mortality and cosmic permanence, anchoring the community's dead within the same order that structured the heavens. The Middle Ages in Europe preserved this linkage between stars and death through astrological frameworks. Death charts, constructed to predict or explain mortality, reflected the conviction that the heavens and human fate were inseparably linked. While modern science has dismantled the predictive claims of astrology, its persistence across centuries reveals the enduring desire to locate human fragility within an intelligible cosmic pattern. Psychological research on control beliefs shows that perceiving mortality as part of a larger order reduces existential anxiety. The night sky provided the template for such meaning-making, irrespective of empirical accuracy. The Renaissance deepened the association between stars and mortality through literature and art. Shakespeare repeatedly invoked stars as arbiters of destiny, a poetic reflection of widespread belief that human life was scripted in the heavens. Paintings depicting celestial ascensions reinforce the notion that death was not rupture, but elevation. By gazing at stars, individuals encountered both the inevitability of mortality and the promise of continuity, oscillating between dread and reassurance. The night sky functioned as a screen onto which cultural imaginations projected the most urgent human questions. Modern encounters with death under the stars retain these ambivalences. Accounts from soldiers in wartime frequently describe moments of looking upward amid devastation, finding temporary solace in the continuity of the heavens. In letters from the First World War, soldiers wrote of constellations as reminders of home, family, and permanence, even as mortality surrounded them. Psychological resilience studies confirm that such anchoring to enduring symbols enhances coping under extreme stress. The stars offered not escape, but stabilization, situating human vulnerability within a framework that transcended immediate destruction. Astronomy itself has entered into this dialogue with mortality. The discovery that stars are not eternal but undergo birth, evolution, and death reconfigures their symbolic weight. The realization that even stars die, collapsing into white dwarfs or black holes, simultaneously undermines and enriches their role as symbols of permanence. For some, the mortality of stars mirrors human fragility, intensifying existential unease. For others, the recycling of stellar material into new generations of stars and planets provides a narrative of continuity. Astrophysics reveals that the carbon in human bodies originated in stellar explosions, binding mortality to cosmic cycles in a literal sense. The slogan that "we are stardust" is not metaphorical, but empirical, grounding human belonging within astrophysical processes. Neuroscience adds another dimension to this relationship. Studies of death-related cognition show that exposure to vastness reduces defensive reactions to mortality reminders. When individuals contemplate their death while simultaneously perceiving vast natural environments, including star-filled skies, they exhibit lower anxiety and greater openness to meaning-making. This aligns with terror management theory, which posits that reminders of mortality trigger defense mechanisms unless buffered by cultural or symbolic frameworks. The night sky, by dwarfing individual concerns and embedding them within immensity, serves as one such buffer, mediating the confrontation with death. Yet the same exposure can provoke destabilization. Reports of cosmic anxiety describe individuals who, upon contemplating their smallness in relation to the stars, experience acute dread rather than relief. This variability underscores the complexity of human responses to mortality under cosmic perception. Personality factors, cultural framing, and situational context all determine whether the night sky eases or exacerbates existential isolation. The dual potential reflects the ambivalent power of the stars to console by embedding mortality within cycles, or to terrify by exposing the fragility of all existence. As artificial light continues to obscure the stars, the role they once played in grief, continuity, and existential orientation grows precarious. The loss is not only aesthetic but psychological, erasing a universal canvas upon which mortality could be contextualized. Whether new symbolic frameworks will arise to replace the vanished stars remains uncertain, but the consequences of their absence are already evident in the increasing struggle to locate death within a framework of shared meaning. The trajectory of how societies adapt to this absence points toward unresolved tensions that extend beyond astronomy, touching the deepest structures of human survival, community, and identity.